David Seymour is Senior Lecturer in Law at City Law School, University of London. He has written extensively on critical theory, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism and Holocaust memory. He has also published essays on law and the arts, Brexit and the recent COVID pandemic. This presentation will try to make some sense of the aftermath of the events of the 7th of October, in which approximately 1,400 Israelis and non-Israelis were raped, tortured, kidnapped and slaughtered by the terror group Hamas. David's argument is that we can try and make sense of this aftermath through three interrelated thoughts. The first is an understanding of the Jewish question as doppelgänger, or evil twin, intertwined deep within modern social relations. Second, the idea that Antizionism has supplanted, or at the least is starting to supplant, anti-Semitism as the latest iteration of this so-called question. And third, taken together, their combined impact on the meaning of Jewish emancipation today.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I want to welcome you to this session of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. I'm Balázs Berkovic. Today we are welcoming David Seymour. We'll present his October reflections in the aftermath of October 7th event. David Seymour is a senior lecturer in law at City University of London, but he has been publishing about various topics, namely critical theory, Holocaust memory, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. So please welcome David Seymour. And thank you, David, for accepting the invitation. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's be honest, it really wasn't an invitation. I emailed the London Centre and said, please, can you find some room for this? So I want to thank Balázs, David Hirsch, the London Centre, and of course, Martine for organising all of this. Just a sort of preface, I finished writing this about 2 weeks ago, more or less very quickly, and I decided not to go back on it. So I was writing this when the demonstrations around the world were at its height. So this is the moment that these thoughts came to me. So I haven't gone back. I haven't rethought it as such. Maybe I've refined it slightly, and a couple of colleagues were kind enough to comment on it. So it's relatively raw. So bear that in mind. So it was written, I suppose, as I said, about 2 weeks ago. So the full title, and I'm going to do something I don't normally do, which is read it. I'll try and make the reading as engaging as possible, but I'm going to read it. People who've seen me present know that I tend not to do that. But for this, I think I will. I'm going to speak. I did my dry run and it took about 30 minutes. So it'll probably be slightly quicker than that because I'm slightly nervous and I probably speak quicker. So the official title is October Reflections, Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism and the Jewish Question. This presentation tries to make some sense of the aftermath, the demos of the events of 7th October, in which approximately 1,200 Israeli and non-Israelis were raped, tortured, kidnapped and slaughtered by the terror group Hamas. My argument is that we can try and make sense of this aftermath through three interrelated thoughts. The first is an understanding of the irrationality of the Jewish question as the doppelgänger or evil twin of the rationality of Jewish emancipation. The second is the idea that anti-Zionism has come to supplant, or is at least coming to supplant, anti-Semitism as the latest iteration of this so-called question. And third, the combined effect of these two ideas on the meaning of Jewish emancipation today. I just want to sort of put in a addendum at the wrong place. I want to be very careful of how I define anti-Zionism. I've written on this, it's anti-Zionism without the hyphen. Isabella Taborowski writes, just like anti-Semites do battle against a fantasy of the Jews that exists in their own heads, the new anti-Zionisms battle a Zionism, inverted commas, that exists nowhere on earth and is instead conjured up by their own fevered imagination. And I've written, just as the ideology of anti-Semitism tells us nothing about Jews, but everything about anti-Semites, the ideology of anti-Zionism tells us more about itself than it does about Israel or Zionism. So that's what I mean by anti-Zionism. So the first section, the Jewish question as doppelgänger. Although no metaphor or analogy can capture adequately a real-life phenomenon, it seems to me that in answering the questions I just laid out, the closest one can get for explanatory purposes is that of the Jewish question as doppelgänger. A few minutes on what I mean by Jewish question as doppelgänger. Coined first in 1796, a doppelgänger is an apparition, a malevolent double of a living person, an evil twin. A doppelgänger and its original was born at the same moment. The Jewish question is intertwined and accompanies the modern rational world in all its diverse dimensions. The Jewish question offers a malevolent alternative to and dissolution of the entire rational world, its institutions, its social relations, and its rational ways of explaining and critiquing the real world. It does so by stripping away the messiness, the contingency, the contradictory nature of the world, so it claims, to unmask, to make visible the hitherto invisible and omnipotent, malevolent, determining Jewish hand that is said to lay at its center. Put simply, the Jewish question as doppelgänger can best be understood as the modern rational world's absolute and total and totalizing irrational other. It's this quality of doppelgänger that explains the bizarre fact that there is not one aspect of contemporary life, from national and international politics to the most minutest of cultural phenomena, that does not have a double to be found through the prism of the Jewish question. An example that came to mind was the myth of the Israel lobby, that is said to determine anything from US foreign policy to the hotel room which Roger Waters gets to book in Argentina. As rationality's evil twin, the Jewish question reorders the world. It does so by placing the Jew or the Jews at its center and reorganizes everything else around them. This notion of the Jewish question as doppelgänger to Jewish emancipation came to mind over the last few years, during which what has euphemistically been referred to as an uptick of anti-Semitism. This period has included the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, Charlottesville, the Tree of Life murders, and Brexit, around issues of Brexit and COVID. And along with the aura of anti-Semitism connected to these events, what also struck me was the sheer speed with which anti-Semitism replaced and continues to replace rational explanations and rational debate. The more I reflected on these observations, the more I became dissatisfied with existing explanations of anti-Semitism, be they the re-emergence of the longest hatred, anti-Semitism as ideology, anti-Semitism as virus, anti-Semitism as reservoir. Each in their own ways seem to beg the most important question of all. Why a recourse to anti-Semitism was even imaginable in the first place? Why, when confronted with a range of issues and problems, some completely unrelated to Jews, did in a blink of an eye anti-Semitism become an unreflective go-to response? The aftermath of the 7th October events crystallized these thoughts. The aftermath I am referring to is the almost immediate reaction around the globe, which coalesced around the singular issue of Israel's response, or in fact, prior to Israel's response to those events, rather than the events themselves. It was a response that unified disparate groups and supplanted virtually every other political and social issue. A unification evidenced by the singularity of slogans, sheer numbers involved, numbers that have never been, it's claimed, seen before in various cities around the world. Anti-Semitism, and its new section, Antisemitism, Antizionism, and the Jewish question as doppelgänger. In their work, Anti-Semitism and the Left, The Return of the Jewish Question, Robert Fine and Philip Spencer allude to the doppelganger nature of the Jewish question. Framing it through a critique of the duality of universalism, they point to the duality and intimate dialectical relationship between Jewish emancipation and Jewish question. They articulate this duality within universalism by noting its double nature. On the one side, there is universalism as inclusion, premised on a broad conception of humanity. This view is the direction of Jewish emancipation. On the other side, there is universalism as exclusion, a formulation that perceives the Jews solely in terms of their particularity, that not only makes them unfit for inclusion into humanity, but also casts them as a force for undermining the project of human universality itself, in the name of the Jews' own specific, particular interests. That view lies the direction of the Jewish question. It's in this way that what I have termed the doppelganger of Jewish emancipation and Jewish question lies at the heart of the normative social praxis of modern and contemporary universalism. It's this double nature of universalism that goes some way in capturing the fact that, as I mentioned, that not a single aspect of contemporary life avoids this duality. Both emancipation and question is, in other words, deeply entwined and unresolved within the actually existing social world and the relations that taken together comprise that world's totality. It's an actuality that, as noted above, underpins my criticism of anti-Semitism as an asocial, eternal or latent phenomena, something existing outside, beyond or underneath the day-to-day, messy, everyday world. So I want to turn now to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the Jewish question, and the continuities and discontinuities between them. As we've seen, Fine and Spencer understand the Jewish question as a negative response to the call for Jewish emancipation. More specifically, the anti-emancipationist nature of the Jewish question articulates itself through the notion that there was something about the Jews that not only prevented their inclusion within the emerging European nation states, but also that they presented a threat or harm to that body politic, should they be included. This Jewish negativity and its presumed causes varied and developed over time, moving from an emphasis on context and environment of their ways of life of the Jews and their religious practices, to the alleged nature and character of both Judaism and Jews that crystallized through recourse to the pseudoscience of race. Corresponding to these developments was a shift from the potential remedial nature of Jewish shortcomings, so-called Jewish improvements, to that of their irredeemability. It's in this context, therefore, that the Shoah, the obsessive attempt to exterminate each and every Jew captured under the Jewish question's notion of the Jew, was articulated by those who carried it out as the final solution to the Jewish question. The irony of the decades following immediately the Shoah was that it seemed as if its designation as the final solution to the Jewish question was accepted by all concerned. There is no doubt that in the wake of the extermination, anti-Semitism did fall into disrepute. By and large, anti-Semitism in any meaningful sense disappeared from the scene, both as a legitimate way of understanding the world and as a way of organizing populations or large sections of them. However, what the past years and especially the aftermath of 7th October has shown is that there has been a confusion between the demise of anti-Semitism and the demise of the Jewish question. There is an erroneous belief that the articulation of the Jewish question in the form of anti-Semitism has exhausted the Jewish question itself. It is this assumption that needs to be challenged in the wake of the last few weeks. Rather, it's less a case of the demise or exhaustion of the Jewish question through the demise and exhaustion of anti-Semitism than it is the new articulation of the Jewish question that simultaneously subsumes and replaces anti-Semitism, that is, anti-Zionism, as I tried to define it briefly at the top of the talk. This move from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism within the confines of the Jewish question and the replacement of the one with the other is again implicit within Feynman Spencer's work, but is not fully developed there. In the chapter titled "The Return of the Jewish Question and the Double Life of Israel," they observe, I'm going to just read a quick quote, "The most significant expression of the reconfiguration of the Jewish question in the present period lies in the negative presentations of Israel and Zionism. While the stigmatization of the idea of a Jewish nation can be traced back to the Enlightenment credo that everything should be granted to Jews as individuals and nothing to Jews as a nation, it frames the Jewish questions in ways that could not have existed prior to the actual rise of Zionism as a political movement, and especially prior to the formation of the State of Israel and the Holocaust. It's this reconfiguration of the Jewish question that is represented through the more recent iteration of anti-Zionism. This reconfiguration is both the consequence of anti-Zionism's continuity and discontinuity with the Jewish question's previous iteration as anti-Semitism. From the perspective of continuity is the ongoing connection between Jewish question and Jewish emancipation, while its discontinuity relates to the specific nature of the emancipation in question. If anti-Semitism emerged in relation and reaction to Jewish emancipation within the nation state, anti-Zionism is in relation and reaction to Jewish emancipation through the nation state, i.e. the State of Israel, a situation that, as Feynman Spencer noted, is of relatively recent provenance. In an apt phrase that echoes the concept of doppelgänger, the double life of Israel, the chapter that they write indicates the way in which the actually existing state of Israel is represented through the anti-Zionist lens of the Jewish question. They show how the mundane contradictions present in almost all of the world's nation states are flattened out through viewing the state of Israel, quote, as the symbolic representation of all that is illegitimate in the present day international community. They cite three predominant illustrations. the general contradiction and conflict between universal claims of citizenship and the particularity of nationality, along with the social and political discrimination that attaches to such contradiction, becomes, in the case of Israel, reduced to that of apartheid. Similarly, and this point is even more relevant in the aftermath of 7 of October, Israel's past and present military conflict with Hamas is represented as genocide. And thirdly, Israel's occasional rhetoric against Iran, along with Israel's nuclear capability, indeed, if not Israel's existence per se, stands as a unique, quote, a unique threat to world peace. Of course, what needs to be noticed in the present context is that by framing Israel's real and imagined crimes and misdemeanors of which no state is immune, through the language of crimes against humanity, a quote again, Fine and Spencer, the markers of the old Jewish question are not absent in the new. That is the old idea present in the anti-Semitism of the Jewish question of the Jews as separate from and inherently harmful to the nation state in which they lived, is reproduced and reformulated in that question's new iteration of anti-Zionism. Here it places the Jews, in this case the Jewish state, not only outside the global community, but also, and I've noticed this language has been increasing in the last few days, but also as inherently a harmful threat to humanity, or indeed representing the epitome of inhumanity. Perhaps the best illustration of this phenomenon, it's tried and tested, is the number of resolutions passed against Israel in various UN bodies, which at the same time are relatively silent about the crimes and misdemeanors of other states whose actions may be breaches of the triad of offences that I've just mentioned. This is not to say, and I feel bad saying it, but I'll say it, this is not to say, of course, that Israel's actions are either not illegal or that it's beyond criticism, but rather that the matters complained of are, because of its capture through the lens of anti-Zionism, prejudged, or more particularly, essentialized. This last point leads to an observation that has become more apparent after the 7th of October, although again not absent prior to then. That is the representation of the state of Israel through the anti-Zionist prism of the Jewish question that is both wider and deeper than the 3 examples Fine and Spencer provided. Here we can only note or list some of the most overt examples that have come to the surface over the last few weeks. These examples include themes of vengeance, which can be traced back to a bad faith reading of the Old Testament, bloodlust or bloodthirstiness, which is a relatively newer origin, and almost intangibly, but nonetheless present, the blood libel and the Jewish so-called obsession for the slaughter of Gentile children. Finally, in this category, is the revival of the notion that anti-Semitism, if not anti-Zionism, is a legitimate response to inhumane actions of the state of Israel and its so-called apologists, whatever that means. Of course, none of these examples are themselves new or novel, but rather they have come to be subsumed or rather repurposed in the Jewish question's move to anti-Zionism. However, new additions are not lacking. Even if they're not novel, they are nonetheless not lacking. Again, we can note 2 of the most overt that have come to the fore in recent weeks. The first, again with antecedents in the previous incarnation of the Jewish question, is the idea that not only Israel as a state, but Zionism itself is illegitimate, not just for what it does or alleged to have done, but because of its very existence. The clearest illustration of this point is the relatively new but erroneous application to both Zionism and Israel of the concept of settler colonialism. As with the illustrations discussed by Fine and Spencer, this latest allegation is in keeping with the contours and content of the Jewish question, which implies Israel's breach of the normative values of the global order. The force of this latest charge connects with a further aspect of the Jewish question. The contemporary notion of settler colonialism implies the Jewish state's inherent and innate wrongfulness from the very beginning. Although this view shares some characteristics of the racialization of the Jewish question as it emerged, it actually harks back further to the deicide accusation of early Christianity in the sense of some kind of original sin, and that its stain remains tied to Israel, to Zionism and its supporters. Unlike racialization, however, it can be washed away through conversion, through becoming an anti-Zionist, and one washes the stain of connection away. However, it's the second example that is the most pertinent in the present context. In both terms of the dualism of Jewish inclusion, emancipation, and Jewish exclusion, question, inherent within the modern concept of universalism, and of the latter's emergence from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism, it turns on the corresponding dualism of meaning attaching to the post-Shoah maxim, never again. Again, not entirely absent prior to the 7th, since then, reference to this phrase has come to the fore. In many ways, the competing interpretation of the maxim never again encapsulates almost perfectly the idea of the Jewish question as the doppelgänger of Jewish emancipation and of Jewish exclusion and inclusion, respectively. On the one side, never again can mean, from the perspective, from the perspective of inclusion and emancipation, a maxim of applicability to all, including, of course, Jews, including those murdered on 7th of October and the events of that day. However, from the perspective of its exclusionary nature of the Jewish question, the phrase manifests itself in the accusation that from the mouths of Zionists, never again is alleged to mean never again to Jews. It becomes emblematic of Jewish anti-universalistic particularism that contains an implicit lack of legal and moral standards of boundaries. If, as it's believed, never again to Jews means never again the Shoah, the greatest disaster ever to befall Jews, then correspondingly it gives Jews, or rather Zionists, carte blanche to ensure that it really does not happen again. Now, understood in these terms, this anti-Zionist interpretation of never again connects not only with the notion that Israel is actually carrying out a genocide, but also with another recent addition to the armory of the Jewish question, and here I reference Leslie Claff's work, of Holocaust inversion. Holocaust inversion, as we know, points to the idea that the Zionists are the new Nazis. And what the Nazis did to Jews yesterday is identical to how the Jews are treating Palestinians today. Then this bit I added later. Nowhere are these points more in evidence than by a small group of Holocaust and anti-Semitism scholars, at least one of whom has repeatedly made genocide allegations against Israel, dating to about 2015, if not 2018, if not before, was a letter published in the New York Review of Books, and thanks to Tamit for drawing this to my attention, on the 20th November, where they write that invoking comparisons to Nazi Germany, and here we quote, does indeed bring to mind echoes of historical mass violence. but those resonances should serve as an injunction against wide-scale killing, i.e. against Israel, not a call to extend it. However, regardless of the correctness or not of referencing the Shoah to the events of 7th of October, and here I agree with Dave Rich, you've got to be, I would rather avoid it. I don't think it adds anything at all. However, the allegation is not just that adopting the phrase never again in the present context is misplaced, but rather the bad faith allegation of its intentional or alleged intentional weaponization is in fact a call to genocide. I did add one thing. I just want to find where it is. Please bear with me. I've just added this. I was going to leave it out, but fortunately Banash said I had slightly more time, so thanks for this. I want to talk briefly about the Jewish question as the politics of defeat. If I'm correct in treating the Jewish question as doppelgänger to Jewish emancipation, and by Jewish emancipation, I also include the system of right it presupposes, the rule of law, equality, rights, and so on and so forth, that it is not only an alternative way of understanding the world, but also as that world's dissolvent and replacement of the system of right that underpins the practice of emancipation. The question remains, why and for what reason are some sections of the population susceptible to the Jewish question rather than others? This question, I believe, also goes some way to explaining the speed in which the Jewish question seems to appear on the scene. I mentioned that briefly in the introduction. And here it's a very rough, little more than a few thoughts. If we look, albeit briefly, at the modern history of the Jewish question, a pattern begins to emerge, one that remedies the shortcomings of the issue of agency, which I see as inherent in notions of anti-Semitism as latent, longest hatred, virus, reservoir, and so forth. To state the matter bluntly, the Jewish question is little more than the politics, or should I say the anti-politics, of defeat. Since its inception, the Jewish question anti-Semitism has remained a recourse and a temptation for those who at any given moment have suffered a greater or lesser political defeat and potential demise. Looking at this history, it becomes apparent that this recourse and temptation is not safeguarded by any particular perspective. In other words, it's the fact of defeat rather than the politics of those defeated that is the driving force for adopting the Jewish question as a way of explaining the world and the causes of its defeat. If, as will become apparent, it appears that the left or sections of the left are numerically higher in this history, that has less to do with the content or nature of left politics than it does the respective number of defeats it suffered over the past couple of centuries. And here I'm just running, you're going to get 300 years of history in one paragraph. We can see this phenomenon of a Jewish question of politics of defeat playing out at various times. The anti-Semitism of the right following the French Revolution, their defeat in the French Revolution. The anti-Semitism of the radical left in Germany following the defeat of revolutionary ideals. Here I'm thinking of Jakob Fries at that period in history after 1815. The aftermath of the defeats of 1848, and here we need think of figures such as Richard Wagner, the anti-Semitic composer. The anti-Semitism of the anti-Dreyfusards as a coalition of the defeat of various segments of French society, Catholicism, the bourgeois and petit bourgeois, in a number of scandals, plus also their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Now, in fact, the case of Dreyfus is even more telling in this context, since it's the prime example of the way the Jewish question around Dreyfus reorganized the entire population of France for good 10, 15, 20 years. And finally, as if this can't be overlooked, the anti-Semitism of the right following Germany's defeat in 1918 and the emergence of the Weimar Republic. So that's the trend I've picked up. But more recently, and one that impacts on the contemporary emergence of anti-Zionism as the latest iteration of the Jewish question, is the defeat of the left in the face of the defeat of social democracy, socialism, and socialism by the not so new neoliberal global order, and the demise for communism of the Soviet Union. Indeed, one cannot but help but at least conjecture, in the face of this defeat, if not collapse, the only thing left for some, and I stress some, sections of the left, is anti-Zionism. It's a point that speaks to the unity of otherwise diverse factions and interest groups, a point that I alluded to above. Virtually every interest group, progressive interest group, and different factions of the left who normally don't speak to each other are unified around this issue. In other words, the Jewish question as the anti-politics of defeat reaffirms Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, a concept that, not without coincidence, focuses on the emergence of the racial anti-Semitism of his own time, and again with Richard Wagner as his main target. And I'm coming to finish off here. The Jewish question, anti-Semitism, and the fate of Jewish emancipation. One of the most notable occurrences in the weeks after 7 October is a sense of shock, if not trauma, experienced by many diaspora Jews at suddenly and unexpectedly finding themselves alone and isolated among those who they previously felt a sense of belonging and solidarity and security. Perhaps nowhere more has this experience been felt than in the USA, a country in which a feeling of Jewish belonging and security has never been tested to the extent that it has been tested in Europe. More often than not, this experience emerged when the hitherto expected expressions of solidarity and sympathy for the horrors experienced by Israelis were noticeable for their absence. Compounding this experience of exclusion and isolation was the implied stripping away, against their will, of the composite aspects of their social identity to that of a unidimensional singularity of Jews, most notably in their real or purported relation to Zionism and Israel. In fact, it's a singularity that has been imposed externally, one could even say violently, upon them. And a similar imposition is not lacking in its application to anti-Zionist Jews, be they the NK or liberal Jews. Suddenly you became Jews. It seems to me that this sense of shock many experienced can be understood not only as a sudden and unexpected realization of the fragility of Jewish emancipation and the sudden and unexpected realization of the resilience of the Jewish question, but the sheer speed in which inclusion turned into exclusion and previous political and social divisions became eroded and reorganized around the figure of the Jew and or the Zionists. Conclusion. It's in this case, it is the case that the brutal attacks of 7th of October unexpectedly and violently exposed the vulnerabilities of the state of Israel, literally, as did an unexpected, if not so violent, appearance of the anti-Zionist iteration of the Jewish question, exposed the vulnerability of Jewish emancipation in the diaspora and in places where it was least expected. However, what the recent events have also shown us is that while the vulnerability of Israel can be overcome by a true and meaningful peace with the Palestinians, the quest for true and meaningful Jewish emancipation and the overcoming of the Jewish question in the diaspora may not be so easily resolved. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was really great. That was a very, very complex presentation, which gives us much material for thought, for further reflection, of course. So, any questions so far? I would like to ask everyone to formulate your questions as briefly as you can. Anybody? Yes, please. Tammy Peterson.
Hi, David. Thanks for that. It was really, really good. I really enjoyed that presentation. I was wondering, I've noticed part of this, I'm really intrigued by this idea of universalism as exclusion and universalism as inclusion at the same time. And I think we're seeing a lot of those conversations in the United States in particular around Jews as being perceived as white, and how this has been going on, you know, even before October 7th, where Jews were kind of seen as not a legitimate, they were included so much on the left that they're not seen as a legitimate ethnic group and you know, worthy of sort of protection under like DE&I initiatives and things like that. So I was wondering if you could explore that a little bit. And then another thing that's continued to happen, and I don't know how many of you saw the footage from the Oakland City Council meeting last night, but you had people from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is, I guess, used to be a Trotskyist group, or maybe still is, you know, basically saying that it was an inside job, and saying this at the council meeting, that Israelis killed their own citizens, that Hamas was a liberation group, and so lots of really crazy stuff that I actually wouldn't believe unless, you know, I saw people saying it on video. But so there's another part of that, maybe that's tied into another part of that thing, as you know, Jews being so outside of the you know, the international good, that they would kill their own people. And that seems to be coming out more and more. I think also like Owen Jones recently, yeah, maybe today, I saw someone critique him. He was basically implying that, you know, he saw the footage and he didn't see any direct murder of children. And because of that, and he didn't see anybody being directly raped. So therefore, you know, it's really just the word of the IDF. So there's this kind of like, you know, how is that tied into it as well? Because again, these are, like you mentioned, specifically anti-Zionist things, but there is a sense in which they're also part of that like deeper Jewish question that you're talking about. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tammy. One question is a lot easier than the other, so let me start with the easy one. Easier one. There's no doubt that, as many of people have said, at the heart of anti-Semitism or Zionism, anti-Zionism, is conspiracy theory. And I noticed that some people called those speakers the QAnon of the left. You know, it's deep, old-fashioned conspiracy theory. But you hit on something interesting there as well. Is there nothing that those evil Jews would not do to hoax the world to allow them to carry out genocide? I mean, that's crude, vulgar, Jewish question stuff. But it relates, of course, and I think that's what I mean, and I might have toned down the anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism in the paper. It's subsumed. And I know there are a couple of people here would hate me to use this analogy because it's wrong. But in a way, if we take Hegel's notion of subsumption, and of course, it can't work like this, the dialectic, because there's no dialectic in the Jewish question. But all these ideas become subsumed under its new iteration. The content changes slightly, but the target changes quite a bit, even though it then splatters everyone related, so-called supporters of Israel. And I think the other question I want to answer in the same way, in a way, the two issues are contradictory. The people who stood up in wherever it was, where was it?
Oakland, California.
In Oakland, California, they are the true universalists. They're the true universalists of the Jewish question. There is a humanity, and this one lot of people aren't fit to be part of it. We can't trust them. They do terrible things, they do evil things, and they lie. The Owen Jones line. Yet the other thing you'll talk about, and I'm not so au fait with that whole issue, maybe coming from Europe, but it strikes me that dissolves universalism anyway. There is no universalism there. Everything is broken down into a particular. The claim of universalism by one group is fake and sham and hoax, and silences and excludes everyone other, whereas the other side saying we don't want to be part of the universal, we are particularist. I don't know if I've understood that correctly, but it strikes me that whole politic is a dissolution of universalism. It refuses to. And finally, of course, again coming from Europe, I find it terribly imperialistic in the sense that the American left have one view of the world, and everything has to fit into it. Stuff that doesn't exist. And I think on a broader level, issues relating to Jews over history finds it very hard to fit into universalist histories. It's a really interesting, because growing up, Israel used to be we used to fit it into an anti-imperialism that it was Americans' watchdog in the Middle East. So we had to fit it into that type of discourse. Now we're fitting it on the one hand that Jews are white supremacists on speed, they're more white than white, whilst on the other hand they're also evil. So it's this constant, and even the history of Israel, which is highly complex, we try always to force into, I'm thinking of Adorno here, we're forcing into a general category that it doesn't quite fit, and spits out or leaves out some really horrible stuff. So I hope that goes some way to answering those questions. Thanks, Tammy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. Bernardo Lerner, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for that talk. What now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna put it. Yeah, it's me, not you. Yeah.
No. I had left a speaker connected. Thank you very much for that talk. I'd like to complicate matters a little bit with sort of 3 points that I'd like you to hear you react to. First of all, anti-Semitism did not disappear. It disappeared in our neighborhoods or in the West, but it continued in the Muslim world and the Soviet Union. So it had a place to continue its life, and then going into a global situation where there's perhaps more interaction with those worlds. Secondly, I think particularly in the United States, I don't know that the cultural left really feels that the fall of the Soviet Union was a defeat for it. I don't think they even know about it. And finally, I think that besides the kind of dialectic of philosophical notions regarding nation states in the West, I think there's simply state actors who are promoting this anti-Semitism, and they may be hanging on sort of base and superstructure. It's useful for them to tie into this history of ideas about the Jewish question and so forth, and how it relates to the nation state and the liberal state. But really, they have their realpolitik interests at hand, and they're pushing it. So I was wondering how you would relate to these different factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Karma is a strange thing. Having just talked about American-centric ideas, yes, Eurocentric, without doubt. The first thing to say about Muslim and Muslim world and Eastern Europeans, communist Soviet Union, anti-Semitism. Yes, you're right, but I also think, as Isabella Tabarovsky has shown and others, Jeff Herf has shown, it's true. It's, you know, crude anti-Semitism was its origin. It was imported in, you know, according to Jeffrey's work, imported into the Muslim world. In the East, it came from a particularly virulent, nasty right-wing Russian trajectory, plus state politics, etc. But even there, it twists slightly. It might, in those cases, I think, or at least in the Russian, from what I know of the Soviets, it in the notion of the Soviet one, it was crude anti-Semitism, but then literally implanted on Israel. And you get that, especially after 1967, when the communists were supporting Egypt and that side, and they lost. So there we're beginning to see a slow transition from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism, in my opinion. And in terms of the American left and the relationship to the Soviet Union, yeah, I'll take your word for that. Okay, I don't know enough to comment on that. But the other thing of state actors, now I find this really interesting because I look at the history from the latter part of the 19th century. And by that time, states, we'd had full Jewish emancipation. And looking at the anti-Semitic movements from that period, in fact, struck me as less of a state-sponsored activity than picked up by groups as an anti-hegemonic, as an anti-state position. And I think the idea that anti-Semitism masquerades as liberation, I think, is a more accurate picture in some, again, I'll talk about European Western states.
I was talking about different state actors, such as the huge investment of Gulf states in American universities, and you know, Iranian interference with social media and things like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Iran, I think you're dead right. What I find interesting at the moment about many of the Gulf states, and I'm not an expert on the Middle East at all. I don't want to, you know, this is an opinion from somebody who reads the newspaper, not as an academic. But what strikes me is I can't help feeling that despite the rhetoric, Israel is doing a lot of the Gulf states' dirty work for them because of Iran. There's a whole politics going on at the moment with Hamas and the Middle East that I don't fully understand. But yes, there are still some state actors that if push comes to shove, they will use anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. Yeah. Thanks. I hope they go some way to answer your question.
Thank you. Andrew Apostolou.
Oh, hi. I don't know if you can hear me properly.
Yeah, we can. Andrew.
Okay, thank you. No, just quickly on the whole point about Jews being considered white, which you're absolutely right, it is the imperialism of America in some ways, but it also feeds into historic anti-Semitism, doesn't it? Because remember, in Eastern Europe before the war, the anti-Semitic belief was that you could always tell who the Jews were because they didn't look white. They were dark. They had dark skin. They had dark hair. And interestingly, in Greece before the war, the anti-Semitic belief was you could always tell who the Jews were because they had fair skin and they often had ginger-colored hair. So Jews can never really fit in visually in the anti-Semitic mind. And it's interesting how, as you called it, American sort of left-wing imperialism incorporates that.
Yeah. I've got nothing to add, only the personal story that my father, when he was growing up, was told to sod off back to Palestine, and after 1948, you know, it turned around. So yeah, it's always been one side of the divide or the other. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I hope the seance is working.
Thank you. We have some questions in the chat. Eve Coleman is asking, how do you explain that people like Norman Finkelstein and other left-wing Jewish individuals, also in France, some left-wing collectives propagate so many anti-Jewish tropes, equate Zionism and Nazism, and deny anti-Semitism.
Thanks, thanks, Eve. I don't know if I can or want to answer that. I mean, I don't like, psychological analysis. I don't know. It could just be a political commitment. I mean, if we go back to left politics, and the same is true of a right politics as well, many Jews feel that Jewish identity, especially if it's considered, so from the left, Zionism is considered a right-wing thing. Although I'm hesitant to explain any of this, it strikes me that their politics is what guides them. It's the politics that guides them. So, that famous quote from, was it Rosa Luxemburg, about, I care about everybody. Why should I why should I particularly care about the Jews in a ghetto? I think that was driven by her universalistic politics. And to be generous to some people, I think that could be, I don't want to talk about any individual. I think that's possibly true. I think that, for example, Jewish Voice for Peace or Peace Now, I think it's their political commitment. I think it's a bad politics. I think it's wrong, but I think it's their political commitment almost that falls into the type of universalism of the Jewish question that Robert and Philip was speaking about. I'm not, I'm with Arendt on this. I'm not happy on psychological arguments why people do things. So I'm wondering whether it's, to be generous, it's a political wrong political belief. There are other explanations, but that people advance. But I'd be happy. I'm happier sticking with that one, a certain ideological commitment. And we see this we see this early on in the Soviet Union. There were Jewish communist members whose belief in communism in the Soviet Union and the belief that Judaism and Jews was a particularism that needed to be gotten rid of, that's what drove them. So I think I'll stick with that rather than any other type of explanation. Eve, I hope that answers your question to a certain extent.
Thank you. We have another question from the chat. Emma says that I'd like to hear more about the idea of the left clinging to anti-Zionism because they lost, like fall of the Soviet Union, neoliberalism, defeat of Corbyn and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think what I'm trying to say, if we can find patterns in history, okay, there's 2 dissertations and a book on that. If we can find a pattern in history, it strikes me that the Jewish question offers an easy answer to difficult defeats. That's really all I'm thinking about. I mean, so, I'm not saying, and I thank you for your question, Emma, I don't think I'm saying that if you lose, therefore you believe everything, you believe your downfall was because of Judaism or Zionism. That can happen. But I think in the cases of the left in Britain, I'm sorry, I'm becoming, or even in Europe, again, I want to be careful about the States and elsewhere. It strikes me that if we go back to 1985 or whenever, we lost the miners' strike. We lost. The left was heavily defeated by Thatcherism, Reaganism, etc. And we've yet to come back. And I say we, because that's where my political home is. We've yet to come back. And no matter what we've tried over the years, nothing has brought us back together. We have suffered defeat upon defeat upon defeat as the left. Suddenly, the one thing that can coalesce the left, or certain sections of the left, is around the Jewish question. And I think that was one of my biggest immediate impacts of watching the demos of a couple of weeks ago, of the one voice, the one thing we could organize around, they could organize, because that's where I part company, they could organize around, was Israel, and Israel and Palestine, Israel and Gaza. The one thing. And it brought together, I mean, over the last few weeks, we've seen Just Stop Oil, the climate change, the sort of radical factions, the mad radical factions of the left who hate each other more than they hate anybody else, with a love in. You've also got sort of a certain liberalism, a liberal right, a liberal centre that joins in, even less elements for various historical reasons of the right. So it's sort of, it's that, it strikes me that that's what I mean. It's a bit like the Dreyfus moment. That's what I mean by reorganizing the political world around the Jew. And the Jewish question is a temptation. It's always easy in defeat. And that's exactly what happens, we see again after 1848, the 50s and the 60s in Europe. We lose the 1848 revolutions, sets in reaction. The left are defeated. They're smashed to smithereens. They can't even get, anything through any of the what counted as the democratic means. And suddenly large sections of the left turn anti-Semitic, turn to the Jewish question. So that's what I think I mean. And I've just added that recently, but that's what I think I mean by the Jewish question as a temptation and a resource for as a politics or an anti-politics of defeat. And it also gets away from the idea that either the left or the right is inherently anti-Semitic or inherently anti-Zionist. I don't think that's true. Historically, it's not true. I mean, Jeffrey Hirst's new book, and some of us growing up, the left were the Zionists and the right were the anti-Zionists. And I think it's this idea that the Jewish question latches on or can latch onto anything. The irony of the image of the Jewish question is that the image the anti-Zionists and the anti-Semites have of the Jews is that they leech onto everything. We know all of this. It's horrible to repeat, but that's what it. But in fact, as so often the case, that's exactly what the Jewish question does. It leeches onto everything and everything. Tomorrow, it could be the right. It could be liberalism. At the moment, it's with its strength of feeling is with the left. But I don't think it's anything inherently left that's distinct from the rest of the political spectrum. It's just that the Jewish question threatens to undo everything it touches. Sorry, Emma, I went a bit of a rant on that. I hope that answers your question to a certain extent.
Thank you. I would ask a question, if I may, as well. So, what we have learned exactly from October 7th. So we saw people, we know people who haven't learned anything from it. But since your presentation highlighted very complex issues with anti-Zionism being the iteration of the Jewish question. And so many people, we have been dealing with these aspects for a long time. So in a way, we may feel vindicated as like, look what people's reactions are. Look how the left reacts. But what exactly is new that we wouldn't have thought about before the event, or yeah.
I think you're dead right. I mean, this presentation perhaps onto work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. I think the only thing that's new is the fragility. I think that's what shocked and traumatized a lot of people. We thought, and again, I'm sorry, I'm talking about a country I'm not truly aware of, especially in the States, but here as well, but more so in the States, was the sense, and again, it's not new, but it's new for a lot of first time for a few decades, that somehow we're not quite as part of the gang as we thought we were. We're not quite as assimilated or emancipated. And I want to be careful with that word because I know it has a meaning. You know, we thought we were American who happened to be Jewish, or Brits happened to be Jewish, and we disagreed on this and that, but we weren't. Suddenly, they felt isolated, stripped of anything else other than they felt vulnerable as Jews. And that's not normally an expression I like to use, but suddenly they became as Jews. And I think that's what the shock and the trauma was outside. I'm not talking about Israel. I mean, I'm talking about the diaspora. I think that's what's new. We sort of wrote about it and we felt it. We talked about it during the Corbyn years, amongst, you know, the Labour Party, sections of the Labour Party and other people in other contexts. But I think it was almost that moment of fragility and vulnerability. I think that's the takeaway. That's what's new and has brought all this stuff into focus, I think. Yeah, that's my own take.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. We have some new questions in the chat. Tanya Aman asks, in open letters in solidarity with Palestinians from academia or parts of the cultural scene, there's the demand to defund Israel's military or other things that demand to erase. Sorry, I just can't read this.
To erase Israel from the map, and at the same time they say they're not anti-Semitic. So what kind of strategy is it?
I think that's. No, go on, Bash.
No, is it a strategy to exclude anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism? That was the last line.
If I understand the question, an open letter. Sorry, I'm just reading it myself. At the same time, the right supporters, I think they are against that. Sorry, they believe themselves firmly to be against anti-Semitism. They firmly believe that. I mean, when a Jewish cemetery was destroyed in America a few years back, Linda Sassor said, "This is terrible. I'm standing with my Jewish brothers and sisters," and she collected money. So I think two things there. I think first, they would be shocked if they were called anti-Semitic, and they don't think of themselves in that way. And I think they are anti-Zionist. And I think anti-Zionism is in that extreme form, is a new iteration of the Jewish question. And I see, and what I guess has led to this as well, I've seen on social media and elsewhere, X is anti-Semitic, but anti-Zionism isn't. So you've got this sort of residual anti-Zionism that can't be contained, you know, anti-Zionism, as I explained it at the beginning, that can't be contained in anti-Semitism. And so there's this little bit left over that almost seems to take on an aura of legitimacy. And that's my trouble, because the world now that produces the Jewish question, or the way it's articulated, is very different from what it was before. And I think, though, that they're probably, you know, it's the anti-Zionism is the problem. That's what we should be focusing on. And the idea of sort of taking an anti-Zionism, as I tried to explain it earlier, and subtract the anti-Semitism is part of the problem. We've moved on since there. We're in a new step of the journey. So for a classic, you know, it's a bit like it was when anti-Semitism hit the field. You know, everyone said, oh, it's very different from religious anti-Judaism. And therefore, if it's not religious, it can't be anti-Judaism. And that was the pseudoscience of race. I think we're going through a similar moment there. And I think this whole debate is particular forms of is the type of anti-Zionism I'm talking about anti-Semitic or not. I think is the wrong debate now. I think we're past that. In a way, you know, to sort of look at your question in a slightly different way, in a way, anti-Semitism is becoming a defense against anti-Zionism. You know, so as I said, these are just thoughts. I hope it goes some way to answering that question. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. God is asking, could you speak of how the defeated left has allied itself with Islamofascism?
Shortly, no, I can't. But I got some ideas that I think what happened, if I remember in England when the SWP a couple of decades ago joined up with the Islamicist wing of politics. One of the arguments I remember reading, and I don't know if it's right or not, is that, you know, again, with the dissipation of social democracy, people's class identities fell away. So there was no, you know, the end of industry, the end of the traditional working class, the rise of, you know, Thatcherism, and everyone could be private house owners and everything like that. And I think maybe one of the things I remember reading was that they had to look around for a new constituency. And it was the Islamicists, you know, as anti-imperialists or having the image of anti-imperialists. I think that was the connection. But I don't want to talk about, well, I talked about for the last 40 minutes on what I don't know about, but I don't want to talk about stuff I really don't know about. But I think it all goes to the decline of the sort of 1945, 1979-ish structure of society. I mean, we've seen this with the mainstream centre-left parties under Blair. You know, whatever we think of Blair or not, he sort of sensed a change, and the way he got into power was sensing that change. And I think the left, defeated, were looking around, as I say, for a new constituency. But that's my own particular take on that. And also there is this romantic, and I think it's racist, there is this racist colonial idea on the left that somehow people from Africa, the Middle East, they're sort of the noble savage, not my term. You know, there's this romanticism going on, which I think is absolutely disgraceful, lack of judgment, and also racism, and a belief that anyone who, a non-judgment belief that anyone who opposes the Western powers must be on the side of the angels, blah, blah, blah. You know, that's my take on it. Gad, I hope that goes at least some way to answering, but I want to be careful on how well I speak about that, because I'm not sure.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have some more comments in the chat, not real questions, though those are worth to be read. But so just one more thing, maybe, that I was intrigued by this letter you mentioned that was published in the New York Review of Books, when Holocaust researchers said that the analogy with the Holocaust is not helpful. Not only not helpful, but it's being instrumentalized by Israel, whereas Israel is the one that is committing genocide, right? And so this letter was in fact signed by people who are promoting all kinds of Holocaust analogies and metaphors, right? Just to mention one, multi-directional memory, right? So they don't espouse the usage of the Holocaust analogy when it's about Israel and Jews, and when Jews are feeling that this is somehow, well, not the repetition of the Shoah, of course, but somehow similar to at least an episode of the Shoah in the manner of the Einsatzgruppen, for example. So they are arguing against that, but in all other issues, they would absolutely promote Holocaust analogies, let that be for slavery, colonization, and all the way. So in a way, Holocaust is everything, but the Holocaust itself and what Jews are asserting that is going on with them. So how would you react to that?
Funny you should say that. I wrote something a little while back about this, and the model I used was the idea that the Holocaust has been commodified. And I was sort of using the Frankfurt School, but the idea was that it's been universalized at the expense of its particular. What I mean was it's been applied to everything. But if the Jews start using Holocaust analogies, then they're being particular. They're trying to stop its universal aspect and want to weaponize it for themselves. And that's when it becomes illegitimate for them to do so. Everyone else can use it because it's been universalized. So it's become, man's inhumanity. The Holocaust is man's inhumanity to man. So that its Jewish content, so to speak, has been taken out and it's deemed as illegitimate and against the universal, against the universalism of never again, for those selfish Jews to use it for their own. And then they become panned for that. So you're right. I think it's to do with the commodification of the Holocaust and its emptying out of its Jewish content. And then it becomes resented that the Jews should actually use it. As I said, I wrote about that a little while, but I hope that's clear. That's what I think on that. It's a form of ressentiment again. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, well, one more question. Anna, please.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, David, for your lecture. It was really amazing and yeah, it was really impressive. Thank you so much. I have a question. Sorry, it will be a bit chaotic, but I'm trying to figure out my mind. I would like to ask about the importance of the anti-migrant policies of European countries, such as Germany or UK or France or Poland, where I come from, and the importance of the structural racism in those countries for this. What is the importance of all this for this dynamics of anti-Zionism on the left? Because my impression is that this policy, this anti-migrant policy affects mostly Muslim and Arab migrants. So the left, in act of the solidarity, join them in their struggles, and then there is then this whole mixture with anti-Zionist discourses from the Middle East emerge. So my question would be how to solve it, because I have the impression that it's a really complicated issue right now on the left in European countries. In Poland, it's just the beginning, let's say, of those complications, but in UK, for sure, it has long history.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And there's no doubt that the anti-migration is Poland. I mean, fortunately, you've got a new government. Hooray! So maybe things won't be so bad. But Hungary and other countries, without doubt, it's an anti-Muslim stance. Now, again, this is a personal take. Okay, it's a personal take. I don't know enough. I think the majority of people who come to Britain or other countries are really just concerned with getting their lives back together. I always think that it's actually the second or third generation of people who are here. I remember, talk about my own experience. I'm mix of second and third generation. Mm-hmm. And my great grandparents, they ended up here instead of New York, which I'll never forgive them for, but they ended up in London. And I would speak to my grandmother about the old country, and she didn't want to know. And then I guess I was about a teenager, and suddenly I wanted to be authentic. I wanted to be this. I wanted to be, I was going to change my name back to my father's name that he had to change. And, and there were people there, not really nice people, who would sort of encourage me. See, you've lost out on all of this, and you've lost out on all of that. And you want to be authentic. And I actually think it's less the first generations who come over. It's more and it could be a product of the alienation and racism that they suffer in the home country, in the country they come to, that suddenly they feel rejected from the world they've been brought up in. Mum and dad just want to put food on the table and marry them off to nice families, whereas the kids feel that mum and dad are betraying something. And there's these groups that pry on that. I mean, the classic example is if you go to Jerusalem, you go as a secular Jew. And my advice to my kid when he went to Israel was don't talk to anybody with a beard, because people play on that sense of betrayal that, you're not having your authentic life that you would have in the old country or according to your tenets of religion. So I think the problem is less with the migrants coming over, this is my own take, and more with how the society that has them here needs to rethink itself.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe we should stop here. Thank you, David, again for this great presentation, and I think we had a wonderful discussion.